if you're going to read prophecy and you're going to approach it and say, well, it must be literally what it says because that's how God speaks. No, that's not how God speaks. If you study Bible prophecy, you see that Bible prophecy is heavily laden with symbol. It's told not exclusively, but heavily through symbolism and an integration of symbolism with historical reference, of course. It's not just meaningless, obviously, but it's symbolic. And you have to understand the symbolism or you are going to misread the symbolism of Bible prophecy. And that's why I would argue most Christian Bible prophecy pundits today are completely wrong in their interpretations, in their system of interpretation, because they're not reading Bible prophecy, they're reading it more literalistically or hyperliteralistically, rather than understanding the symbols in the New Testament, how they are rooted in biblical prophetic symbols in the Old Testament.
Aloha and welcome to another show, guys. Today my special guest is Brian Godawa, making his second appearance on the show. We're diving into his book, God Against Gods. In this conversation, Brian discusses how ancient cultures use symbolism and allegory like Leviathan and the collapsing universe to convey deep spiritual truths. He explains how these symbols, often misunderstood today, should be seen within their cultural and library context, not taken literally. Brian also shares how Christians can use these ideas in modern storytelling to engage with today's culture. We also explore how pagan concepts were redefined for Christian purposes, the connection between pagan gods and demons, and the role of spiritual warfare. Before we get started, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and review the show. It's the best way to help our ohana grow. Also, to keep this show free, I'll be adding some promotional codes in the description. If you purchase through those links, you'll get a discount and I'll earn a small commission at no extra cost to you. Without further ado, let's get this show going. Thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate you coming back on the show. And thank you for coming on a little bit earlier, too. That really helps out a lot.
Sure, no problem.
It was a pleasure speaking to you the last time. I received a lot of great feedback from our conversation. Oh. Yeah. And the topic that we talked about, which was the spiritual world of ancient China, I think that really resonated with a lot of people. They were really interested in that topic. So today, I'm hoping that we get just as much positive response as we did the last time. So your book today that I want to talk about is God Against Gods. Boy, that was a really, really good book. So I'm excited to get into that. First, I guess I would like to start with the foundation of your approach. For those who may not be familiar with that, you wrote a lot about apologetics. I never heard of that before. So could you explain what that is and how you use that in storytelling in your book?
Yeah, so God Against the Gods was inspired because of two things: my love for apologetics, as well as my love for the ancient worldview and all its poetry and imagery and myth and narrative, right? Whether it's Babylonians or ancient Hebrews, I loved both of those things. And as I was studying more about the ancient mythology, particularly comparative religions, that is, ancient religions like Babylonian religion, Egyptian religion, Canaanite religion, in contrast with biblical religion or Hebrew religion, that study brought me into what would I say? It brought me into the revelation of the nature of storytelling in the ancient world and how it is used polemically. And the word polemic means argumentatively, right? So you might say, I will provide a polemic, meaning I will provide an argument for something. And so the the idea here is that through their myths or narrative theology or whatever, ancient people would often be making their arguments against other gods polemically. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute, but I discovered that that's what the Bible itself was doing. And normally you'll read liberal scholars versus conservative scholars, and liberal scholars will they're trying to discredit the Bible, so they try to find things in the Bible that are similar to other ancient religions, whether it's their myths or stories or whatever, and they'll try to say, see, they're all just sharing and borrowing from each other, and that kind of a thing. But conservatives will, so a liberal will actually deny the uniqueness of what's in the ancient culture and particularly the Bible, right? So they'll say, look at how similar it is, but they'll deny what makes it different, because as we know, in this world, there can be things that have a lot of similarities, but they're very different, right? In essence or in nature. And so the difference could be all the difference in the world. But by contrast, conservative scholars would tend to ignore the differences and just focus, they ignore the similarities and just focus on the differences because of their fear of, Christians discovering these similarities and being swept up into the liberalism, right? So in some ways, both conservatives and liberals act out of fear of the other side. And as I looked into it, I started realizing, both sides have some truth in what they're talking about and what they're depicting, whether it's the similarities between the Bible and other ancient religions, or whether it's the similarities or the differences. Both of them must be taken into account to understand the full picture. And when you do that, you then begin to understand the real meaning and purpose behind it. So let me give you my favorite example, Leviathan. We read about this creature called Leviathan in the Bible, and he's got a whole chapter dedicated to him in Job, right? It describes Leviathan, and he's basically the sea dragon, right? And if you look through the Bible, you see this Leviathan showing up in many different locations. And so some Christians will say, oh, it's a dinosaur, right? It's a dinosaur, or it's a real creature because it looks like it's being described as a real creature. The problem is that this real creature, this Leviathan, is symbolic of chaos theologically throughout the Old Testament, and as well as the New Testament, actually. But the creature is killed multiple times, is destroyed multiple times, but also it breathes fire. If you read in Job, it breathes fire, right? Its scales are literally impenetrable. There's no dinosaur or creature on the face of the earth in all of history that has done that. Now you might say, oh, well, but there maybe was, but they're extinct. Sure, I guess you could speculate and believe that if you want. But my point is that if you look closely at the description of Leviathan, you'll see that, and we will look at some of these passages, you'll see that it's very descriptive, but it's not descriptive of any known creature ever. And there's a reason for that. And the reason why is because I think that it is a symbolic creature that symbolizes chaos. And chaos versus order was a very dominant theme in the ancient world, including in the Bible. And we find that actually surrounding religions, whether it's Egypt with Apophis, the serpent of the seas, or Canaan, the land of Canaan, which also had a creature called Leviathan. Translated, it would be the same. It's a little different in their language, Lotan, but it's the same thing, Leviathan, or Leviathan or something. And so consequently, you've got this creature, and by the way, it has many heads. Sometimes it has 7 encircling heads, and in Canaan scripture, Leviathan is described as the serpent, swirling serpent with many heads, right? And but if you read the other passages in these other religions, you'll see it's very clearly describing a symbolic creature that their god, their storm god, usually Baal or Ra or whoever but in Canaanite it was Baal. He's the storm god who conquers the sea and conquers the rivers and conquers the sea dragon, Leviathan, who's in the sea. And what that was is that was an expression, like I said, of their God creating order out of chaos. Because to them, the sea, in ancient world, the sea represented chaos. And why? Because they didn't know what was below it. There was large creatures they didn't know were there. It, sea storms and all this kind of stuff. It was untamable. It represented that which was not tameable by man. But when they created their civilizations, their God created order and created civilization versus the chaos. So that's kind of the common ancient theme. And lo and behold, when you study this in the Bible, you see that same theme is coming through the text of God creating his covenant order out of chaos, and that chaos is represented by the sea and by Leviathan. So let me give you a couple passages of my favorites. Psalm 74. We read, God, my King of old, works salvation in the midst of the earth. And it says, you divided the sea by your might. So, go back and read the whole passage, but you'll see that the context is he's talking about the Red Sea, where God divided the Red Sea and brought the Israelites through, where God, excuse me, what did God do after that, going through the sea? He brought them to Sinai and created his covenant order, right? So the passage says, when you divided the sea by your might, it says, you broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. And that word for sea monsters is dragons, literally the word for dragons, tanim. And it says, you crushed the heads of Leviathan. Wait a minute, plural heads of a singular Leviathan? There's that concept of multiple heads on the Leviathan. And then it says, you gave him as food for creatures of the wilderness. You split open the springs and brooks, and they feasted on him. And this is another motif that you study throughout the Bible and other ancient cultures. The notion of killing Leviathan, splitting him open, and feasting on him was a symbol of their, oftentimes used as a symbol of military victory, but certainly cultural victory over other nations. And then it says, yours is the day, yours also the night. It's talking about Yahweh. The day, the night, you established the heavenly lights and the sun. You have fixed all the boundaries of the earth. You have made summer and winter. So there's creation language now. It's talking about Yahweh. You created all these things. And the context, like I said, is crossing of the Red Sea. So what is that creation language doing there? Why are they jumping back? Well, creation language is always connected to the covenant as well. When God creates his covenant on Sinai, he is creating the new heavens and new earth. It's the order out of chaos, see? And so he's crushing multiple heads of Leviathan in the text. And this notion of the sea dragons and such. So, but that's not the only place. In Isaiah 27, it's talking about an eschatological Leviathan. It says, in that day, the day of the Lord, with his hard and great and strong sword, Yahweh, his great strong sword, he will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent. He will slay the dragon that is in the sea. Now, like I said, this is an eschatological saying connected to the day of the Lord, of God involving in judgment. And he's describing killing the serpent. There it is again, the symbolism. But here's the interesting thing. That language, the fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent, is exactly the same words that are used by the Canaanite scriptures of that time period as well. It talks about Lotan or Leviathan, the fleeing serpent and twisting serpent. And so you see this common language. And by the way, there's a lot more passages about that go throughout the Bible. And then, of course, we have in the New Testament, right, we have the seven-headed sea dragon in Revelation, right? What's going on there? Like I said, if you study this and look at all the passages, you'll see this theme of God establishing his order versus chaos. And that order is often described in terms of creation language. For instance, Psalm 89, same thing. Talks about who can be compared to you, God. that you rule the raging of the sea when its waves rise. You crush Rahab like a carcass. Now there's another term, Rahab, that shows up, and it basically is used synonymously with Leviathan. Look that up, see the comparison for yourself. It says you scatter your enemies, the earth, the heaven is yours, the earth is yours, etc. So the point here that I'm getting to is that the Bible is using this symbol of a sea dragon of chaos that their God, Yahweh, destroys to create his covenant order. And so the liberal looks at that and says, see, they have the same religion as the Canaanites. They're just, swapping it out for their own God or whatever. But I would say, no, what's going on there is, and then conservatives will say, no, that's just, it's literally a dinosaur, or it's like, it's just a simple symbol. It has nothing to do with the Canaanite gods. But I say, no, they are literally drawing from the same cognitive environment of that ancient world. In other words, everybody thought in those terms. Did that mean that they believed in mythological serpents? No, some did, but not literarily. When they're writing their literature, they're deliberately writing this symbolically, and so did the ancient world. And so my point here is that Israel is using the same imagery, but saying, no, Baal is not the storm god who conquers Leviathan, the sea dragon of chaos. Yahweh is the God of storm who creates all nature and storm, right? He's the God who crushes Leviathan or chaos to create his covenanted order. So that's one of my favorite examples in the Bible because it's such a loud one. It's such a big and bold one. But that's one example that shows us that the Bible is polemically using common symbols and images of the ancient world, just like Christians of today. If we were to write, I write novels, right? And if I were to write a contemporary novel, I would use Einsteinian quantum physics as a kind of scientific worldview of my world, wouldn't I? Because that's what we've been brought up in. Whether or not I believed it, I would use it as as an understanding of the world within which my characters or my, how I would think God would operate. But 1,000 years from now, quantum physics will probably be a dead theory. But the point is we all use our common cognitive environment to draw from for our images and symbols in our stories. And that's what I started discovering that the Jews were doing as well.
Yeah, that is incredible. You mentioned in your chapter, I think it was the collapsing universe in the Bible, literal science or poetic metaphor. I think that's the topic that we're kind of talking about right now, where you mentioned about like the falling stars from the skies or the sun turning dark and how symbolic that was, rather than, I guess, literal, it was symbolic.
Yeah, so this becomes a controversial thing because, of course, we know that there are a lot of Christians today who will read, Bible prophecies, and particularly in the New Testament, right, where Jesus talks about maybe, the stars will fall from the sky, the moon will turn blood red, and all that, right? And they'll say, "Oh, see, this must be literal," because modern day Christians are Westerners who have been brought up in a post-enlightened scientific worldview, and we don't even know that we think this way, but we do. So we read language about the stars and the universe, and we always take it literally, and we assume it's literal. Whereas in the ancient world, they use the literal concept of stars and moon and such as symbols of their spiritual reality or symbols of their spiritual world. So let me give you an example like that, about that. So every time, and I've done studies in my book, End Times Bible Prophecy, I have extensive documentation of this, but all throughout the Old Testament, whenever God judged a nation, a city, or a people, he would describe it in several common ways. One is he would describe it as Yahweh coming on the clouds in judgment in some way, or he comes with the clouds, right? But also he describes it as the universe collapsing, like the stars fall from the sky, the moon does not shine forth its light. In fact, the the passage that Jesus was quoting in Matthew, right, when he says the stars will fall and such, he's quoting Isaiah 13. But when you go back to Isaiah 13 and you read it in context, you discover Isaiah 13 is a literal destruction of Babylon that occurred in 539 BC. So God was saying, you're going to take my people in exile, but one day I will destroy you, I will judge you. And he said that God would use the Medes to destroy Babylon. And if you read Isaiah 13, you'll see things like the stars of heaven and their constellation will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will not shed its light. So the same language as stars falling from heaven, collapsing universe, it's used of a historical local judgment that occurred in the past, 539 BC. We know, because that's what the passage is talking about, the destruction of Babylon. There are many other passages of the same thing. The destruction of Edom in 586 BC, when Babylon was coming into Israel, and then they were also destroying other nations. In Isaiah 34, we read, all the host of heaven will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll. All their hosts will wither away. This is the kind of language that modern-day Christians will read and go, oh, well, that hasn't happened yet. Because that's literally the whole universe, right? The whole sky rolling up like a scroll. Well, no, actually it did happen, because if you read the passage in context, Isaiah 34 is talking about the destruction of Edom that occurred. It was a local destruction, but they're using the language of the universe collapsing, the stars and such, as an expression of the spiritual nature of the overthrow of authorities and powers, right? There's several levels to this. One is the stars were often considered to be divine beings or angels, and so therefore when a city fell to another nation, the stars falling from the sky was an expression of saying the heavenly powers and the earthly powers were crushed and fell. Their authority, their power fell, right? For example, in Judges 15, 19 through 20, we read about a very specific incident that happened in 13th century BC, around 1200s, right? During the time of Judges. And this is talking about Sisera. And it says that the king, and there's a battle between these kings and Sisera. And it says, the kings came, they fought. And then a little bit further in the verse, it says, from heaven the stars fought. From their courses, the courses in the heavens, the stars fought against Sisera. So there again is another obvious symbolism, because this occurred, stars weren't literally fighting, right? But the notion was the heavenly powers and the powers that be were in cohesion and were fighting. So when Sisera was fighting these kings, it was like stars were fighting, or stars falling from the heaven, right? So there are many other passages like this, but the short of it is that this language of collapsing universe imagery is always used in the Old Testament to describe actual local judgments of God judging a nation, a tribe, or a city. And it's used to describe two things. One is the fall of their power and their authority, right? And think about it. If you, in general, if you believed, like I mentioned earlier, the Bible talks about the creation of the covenant at Sinai as if it were like the creation of the heavens and the earth. It uses the same language to describe that covenant of Sinai. It's the creation of the earth and the stars and the sky and stuff. So if you use that heavenly language, that's host of heaven and the heaven, if you're using that language to describe covenants or power or authority of nations, right? Well, then when those nations fall, it makes sense you would describe their fall from power or authority as if the stars are falling, the moon turning to blood, and the sun not giving forth its light. And for those who seek to try to make this stuff literal, obviously, the stars did not. The the sky did not roll up like a scroll back in 586 BC, because that would have been, the whole universe would have been, completely sucked into a black hole. That obviously didn't happen, so that's not literal. When you read stars falling from the sky, that's not literal, because one star we know, one star coming within the orbit of our galaxy would destroy the whole galaxy, right? With its gravitational pull and the power of a sun. And then people say, well, no, it's meteorites. Well, now you're saying, they're symbols. Stars falling are symbols of meteorites, which again, you're reverting to symbolism. So my point that I try to make to people is, Christians need to stop reading the Bible so hyper literalistically, because they're misreading it, and they're getting false ideas out of it, because they're not reading it through the lens of the ancient world. And in the ancient world, they believed. Remember Daniel, excuse me, the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece. These were spiritual princes, were over the nations. It says when the book of Daniel talks about how Israel was under Babylon, and then the next government of power after Babylon would be the Medes and the Persians, and then the next power after that would be the Greeks. So in Daniel 10, I think it is, when he's talking about the prince of Persia versus the prince of Greece, that's the historical reference to Greece. The Macedonian kingdom of Alexander the Great was ultimately coming and battling the Medes and the Persians and was going to conquer them. And that actually did happen in history. So when he says that the prince of Persia is fighting against the prince of Greece, what he's saying there is, when there's an earthly battle between nations, each of those Gentile nations has a spiritual authority over it. It's not Yahweh, right? Because they don't worship Yahweh. But they have their own spiritual authorities. And when the earthly authorities are in conflict, so too are the heavenly authorities. This is why there's language in the Bible about the skies opening up and the people seeing chariots in the clouds, right? Like Elisha's servant, Jerusalem's surrounded by all these Assyrians and we're going to be wiped out. And then Elisha prays and says, open my servant's eyes. And he sees in the heavens all these chariots of spiritual warriors around them, protecting them and such. So my point here is that when you see that the language of the Bible, the Old Testament particularly, has this notion of integrated symbolism of the star first of all, the heavens and the stars being representative of the heavenly powers, and that those powers are connected to the earthly powers, so that when an earthly war happens, there's a heavenly war. And then when earthly powers fall, so too do the heavenly powers fall. That's where you get the symbolism, the language of the stars falling from the skies and the moon turning blood red, right? Interestingly, that the passages that a lot of Christians will read, I think it's in Acts 2, where Peter's quoting from Joel. In the last days, the moon will turn to blood, and they see the moon's going to turn to blood. It's like, well, if you read that literally, it's saying the moon turns to blood. So you're believing there's transubstantiation there, that the moon is going to literally turn to blood, not that it's going to become blood red, like the blood moons, right? See, the blood moons are fulfillment of the moon turning to blood. No, it says the moon turns to blood. So my point there is just simply that it's obviously symbolic, so you shouldn't be interpreting it literally. So you need to seek to understand, well, what is the system of symbols that they're using, and how does it all work together? And that was my goal in the book, in both of the books, God Against the Gods and End Times Bible Prophecy. I'm trying to explain how a lot of times our hyper-literalistic interpretation of the Bible misleads us, and we need to seek to understand these symbols, because the biblical writers are polemically using, there it is again, that polemically using common notions that pagans also use, but they're using it for their own purposes, right? Much like today, if I as a Christian, and I've even done this, if I write a movie about vampires or whatever, some mythical creatures that everyone knows, well, those are pagan concepts, right? But I could tell a story where, and there are in fact movies like this where the vampirism is a metaphor for sinful nature of humanity. It's a way to metaphorically, symbolically express that, right? And so that's an example of me polemically using a modern pagan genre of vampire movies or vampire stories, and I'm telling my own Christian story, but I'm changing the symbolism to mean something different than what the world uses. Thus, we have these examples of whether it's Leviathan or the collapsing universe imagery. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I was going to ask you about that, about the symbolism and the allegory that you mentioned about how do you pronounce that? Mythopoetic symbols?
Yeah, yeah, it's a hard word, isn't it? I got the word from Tolkien and C.S. Lewis.
Oh.
Mythopoetic or mythopoeic is a shorter version, but same legitimate word, mythopoeic.
Yeah, so you use these elements in your book and how you enhance the storytelling, and you talked about the horror movies and thriller genres, and Christians and how they can use that to discern, like you were talking about the symbolism today. We can use that today in our modern day. Curious about a natural way to boost your immunity and stay healthy? Well, stick around. I've got some fantastic information for you. Hi, I'm Mia with the Sensible Hippie Podcast. Let's talk about the incredible benefits of elderberries. First, elderberries are packed with antioxidants and vitamins that help boost your immune system. This means fewer colds and stronger defense against illness. Second, they have anti-inflammatory properties that can help reduce inflammation and pain, perfect for keeping your body feeling great. And finally, elderberries are known to support healthy heart, improving circulation and reducing cholesterol. A heart-healthy choice. Llama Natural Elderberry Gummies are a delicious and easy way to enjoy these benefits. Try them today and feel the difference. Go to llamanaturals.com and enter code OHANA for a 20% discount. That's llamaнаturals.com. llamaнаturals.com. You can use that today in our modern day.
Yes, and that's why, this is where sometimes I think Christians can be very misled again with good intentions. They want purity. I get it. Yep. They don't want compromised doctrine or truth or whatever. I get all that. But what they often miss is that when you see that the Bible itself, God himself, uses the common notions of the pagans, but he subverts them and he gives them different meaning for his own purposes, see? Then you start to realize how we too can interact with our culture. You can be in the world but not of it. That means you can use some of their common concepts or their symbols, but you subvert them, you reinvest them with new meaning, like I've been explaining. A classic example of this, going back to Apologetics, one of my favorite passages in the Bible is Acts 17. And in Acts 17 is the classic passage because it's one of the only passages where we see an apostle sharing the gospel with pagans. Most of the stories are, interacting with, trying to get fellow Jews to believe in Jesus, right? But here you have Paul actually talking to, on the Acropolis, to in Athens, the actual, pagans. And what does he say? What does he do? Well, if you look closely, and I've written, I have a chapter of this in the book God Against the Gods. Paul is addressing these men of Athens, right? And he starts to talk to them. And what does he do? He starts saying, I can see you're religious, You worship an unknown God, but I know the God you're trying to worship, right? So he draws from what they believe, and he tries to appeal to them to show them that our Christianity fulfills what yours lacks. And he starts to quote their own poets. And many people are familiar with this, right? He says, where does it say there? For have not your own poets said, right? That, let's see. Oh, here it is. God, I've lost my place here. Determine a lot of lines. Okay, so he says, he quotes these various Stoics. So he quotes Epimenides. He goes, "For in him we live and move and have our being." That's what Epimenides, the Stoic, wrote, right? And then he says, "For even as some of your own poets have said, for indeed we are his offspring." And that's quoting from Aratus, another Stoic. So Paul is addressing these Stoic beliefs. Well, what are these Stoic beliefs? Well, if you look into them, you find out that when the Stoic was saying, "In Zeus we live and move and have our very being," that was literally what they were saying, right? They didn't mean it the way Paul was meaning it, right? They actually meant that because Zeus is sort of the divine spark in all humanity. So as long as humanity is alive, Zeus is alive. In him we live and move and have our being. But we know Paul was meaning something else. He was meaning, all of us are created by God. God's not in us, but he creates literally everything around us, the air we breathe, etc. So in him we're living and moving and having our being. But here's what's interesting. Paul doesn't define that difference. He uses the commonality and quotes it, but he doesn't explain how different it is. Then he goes, as some of your poets have said, we are his offspring. Well, there's this notion that all people, because they're created in God's image, are God's children to a certain degree, right? But when the problem is when the Stoics said that all we are his offspring, they literally believed. Here, let me quote it for you. Let us begin with Zeus. Almighty Zeus, nature's first cause, governing all things. We who live and creep on the earth are thy children. It says that all the marketplaces of human beings, the sea is full of him, Zeus. So are the harbors. Every way we all have to do with Zeus. The idea in the Stoic understanding was that we are literally the offspring of Zeus, and his divine spark is in each of us. Well, clearly Paul did not believe that, but he doesn't define that difference. It's not until later, near the end of Paul's storytelling, that he starts to say things that are contradictory to the Stoic belief. So he starts to say, God will judge the world in righteousness by a man he has appointed by raising him from the dead. All right. The Stoics believed that resurrection was impossible. No one ever resurrected from the dead. The Stoics did not believe in a day of judgment, certainly not by a man, right? So at the end, Paul does describe the differences. This is similarities and differences I was talking about earlier, right? But if you go through the passage earlier, he's quoting from their poets as if he's agreeing with them. So my point here is that he's actually subverting their narrative, their story. The Stoics had a story about the way they believed the world was, right? There was Zeus. Zeus was actually the logos, the logos. The logos is the underlying creative order. And Zeus is simply a personified word that expresses that, right? And then everything that's created is an emanation from Zeus, so therefore we have that divine spark in us, and that our ignorance, we all have an ignorance of that divinity, and that's why we become bad people, because we don't realize we have this divine spark of God. So our salvation lies in overcoming our ignorance and realizing we have God in us, Zeus is in us. So this is the basic storyline of Stoicism that Paul is addressing, and he follows it to a certain degree. And he uses their language, their concepts, their poets, their own words to agree with them before he subverts it and gives it a new meaning and reveals what that new meaning is, if that makes some sense. So this is not just a fanciful thing that I, as an artist, has learned to justify what I'm doing. It's actually what God himself does in the Bible. He draws from pagan concepts, pagan symbols, pagan stories, and he subverts them, redefines them for his own purposes, whether it's Leviathan the sea dragon or it's the Stoic narrative about salvation, right? He'll retell their story, but he'll subvert it by giving it new definitions and meanings. Now, isn't this exactly what the world does to us, right? I mean, they're always retelling our stories, but then giving it new meaning. Like, for example, Do you remember, even a few years back where they had the two movies that came out, Noah and Exodus, Gods and Kings, and they were both Bible stories that were retold by atheists. Both of the directors and writers were atheists, and they were retelling Bible stories, but they made it with a new meaning. They turned the story of Noah that was supposed to be about man's sin before God and turned it into an environmentalist parable about worshiping the earth. They took the Exodus, Gods, and Kings story and turned it into a story that made God out to be a temper tantrum throwing child, right? That was really undesirable for the modern viewer, right? And so in effect, it was sort of subverting the God of the Jews by showing him as a child with a temper tantrum, not worthy of being worshipped, to say the least. So that's what they do to us all the time. They're retelling our stories. So we need to retell the stories and the symbols of today. This is what I have done myself in my writing with my books. Recently I wrote a serial killer story, right? Serial killer, that's a modern genre, right? The story of a serial killer in a campus university, and he's actually capturing university professors, and he's debating them. And the debate topic with the professors is the killer's moral right to kill them. Give me one, if what you say is true about the universe, give me one good reason why I shouldn't kill you and I'll let you go. Right? And of course, this is all occurring within a modern woke university campus. So I'm using all the modern day woke concepts that are going on today and showing where they lead by showing that they are the foundation of this destruction that the serial killer himself represents. So that's one example, but there are many. I think Christians should be writing, like I've written stories of famous atheists. Like we should tell their stories within our own worldview, because that's what they do to the Bible, right? So we need Christians to be telling the stories of Freud, Marx, Darwin, Nietzsche. These are famous, which I've done myself, and I've written some scripts on it, and I've worked on some books like this, where we should tell their stories through the filter of our Christian worldview. And that is what I'm saying here. That's the polemic of truth addressing a contrary worldview. I'm hoping this is making sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So this connection, I guess we can use for Christians, maybe their spiritual warfare today, by looking at that and by connecting that and strengthening our faith by
Sure.
using those.
Yes.
Genres.
Now, of course, I speak as an artist. I encourage people, whether you're a storyteller or an artist or whatever, but I do think, the Act 17 is a good example of people who are not necessarily artists can still employ this concept of get to understand what are the, okay, you're not watching any of the movies and the TVs and the TV shows of today's world, and a lot of them are pretty bad. Granted, I'll grant you that, and we shouldn't subject ourselves to all the garbage. But if you're watching none of it because it's all godless and you're missing the boat, because it's not true, number one. They're not all completely evil. There's some truth in a lot of them. So one of the things that I used to do is I would watch movies because I love movies. And, I wouldn't agree with some of them, enough of them. And sometimes they have some good and some bad. But I would when I go to work on Monday morning, we'd say, oh, so what movie did you watch on the weekend? Everyone would talk about the movies they watched. And then I would talk about the movie, but I would say, well, here's what I liked about the movie, but here's what I didn't agree with. And of course, in every way, it's about my Christian worldview. And so my interpretation of a movie was always through that Christian grid. And I would always be talking about the gospel, how it applies to that movie I saw and why I disagree with whatever. Maybe the movie's saying, we can save ourselves by our own goodness, whatever. Movies have these messages, and you can enter into their world and deal with their stories and their narratives and undermine them by showing how they're false, right? That's one way of doing it. Or, as if you're going to be in apologetics, or if you're going to be whatever, whatever job or world you're living in, seek to understand how that godless world thinks, how the secular world thinks, and draw from their images and learn how to subvert them and invest them with new meaning, if that makes sense. I think trying to think of some of the the big controversies that go on today in today's world. For example, whether it's the racism question or the gender identity questions. Try to seek to apply the Bible to what they're saying and to undermine it. And how you do it is all different. We have many different ways of doing that. I don't know how to do it in all ways. I'm just saying the examples for me is as a storyteller. That's how I do it.
Yeah, it's incredible. I love it. You also connect pagan gods with demons in your book, which I found enlightening. What are the implications of this connection for our understanding with spiritual warfare today?
Yeah, well, I kind of have. Let me go back to the beginning, and one of the things I try to show is that in the Bible there's a understanding that. Let me see if I can find these. So there's a reference to pagan gods as being demons. So, for example, Deuteronomy 32:17, Moses is talking about how the Israelites would come into the land of Canaan and worshipped false gods, right? And which frustrates Yahweh. And he says the Israelites, sacrificed to demons. When they sacrificed to these Canaanite gods, they sacrificed to demons that were not God, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently. In Psalm 106:37, another same reference is it's talking about the same thing, Israelites sacrificing their sons and daughters to gods, the ancient gods, Canaanite gods. And he says they sacrificed their sons and daughters to the demons. The innocent blood of their sons and daughters they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. The land was polluted with blood. So this idea is that these pagan gods of the nation, the Canaanite gods Baal or the Egyptian gods Ra, etc., they're not just fantasy creatures that don't exist. There's some demonic reality behind them. Now, am I saying that they all really are existing demonic beings? No. I don't know how it all works, but all I'm saying is clearly the nature of the pagan worship is such that the Bible is saying there is demonic reality, spiritual reality behind these gods. How they're deceiving people, that's up for interpretation, but there's demonic reality. And unless you forget, Paul reinforces the same notion in the New Testament, right? When he's talking about pagans sacrificing their food to idols, right? And should we eat the food or not? And he's describing to them in 1 Corinthians 10, and he says 18, and he says, consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices to a god participants in the altar? If you're eating the food sacrificed to a god, aren't you participating in that altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No. I imply, and here's the key, that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. So again, there's this notion that, so I guess what we should draw from this is that when we are dealing with the pagan religions around us, whether it's, and nowadays we're a very multicultural world, even here in Texas, we've got lots of Hindu Indians and a lot of Hindu, a lot of Muslim, right? A lot of Buddhists here, even in Texas. And so when you're dealing with them, you have to understand that this isn't just ideas and these aren't just false gods that don't exist. They're just imaginary fantasy things. There's actual demonic reality behind them. And that you're evangelizing to these people, you have to realize this is spiritual warfare that's going on. So you shouldn't take that lightly. You should heavily invest it with prayer. The time that you spend with people, you should go out and seek seek to bring the gospel to people. But understand that these pagan religions are not just fantasy ideas. There's demonic reality behind them, and you are engaging in spiritual warfare. What does that mean, and how do you do it? That's a whole nother discussion. Lots of people spend a lot of time on that. I have not. Other than, the Bible clearly says, cast down all thoughts and make them captive to Christ, right? And the idea there is through the preaching of the gospel, through the confrontation with scriptural truth, that is one of the ways in which we are battling spiritually, right? So that it's important to know the scriptures. It's important to be able to use those scriptures in your discussion with people. Does that mean you have to say, Leviticus 19:12 says, or Matthew 24 says? No, you don't have to quote the verses, because if you look at Acts 17, when Paul is addressing the pagans, not once did he ever cite a Bible verse. He made some quotes, but a lot of paraphrases. And so my point there is that don't be hung up on needing to quote Bible verses, but you have to get hung up on knowing the content of Scripture and being able to address it and use that, and realize that when you're interacting with these pagan belief systems, that there's demonic reality behind them. It's not just a bunch of ideas, So you need to be prayed up. You need to be aggressively pursuing the face of God in your prayer life, etc., and studying His Word in that context, and know that that's the context you're working within, for sure.
That's true. What about idols today too? People, a lot of people have idols, even just, let's say, a cross that they wear. Would that be considered an idol?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of Christian discussion about these things. Icons is another. There are Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox do have icons, and they believe that these are windows through which they can interact with the spiritual world and such. And there are different beliefs, even within Christianity, about that. I come from a Protestant perspective, so I do consider that to be idols. You should not make any images, and you should not be praying to images. There is no window. There's no mediator other than Christ Jesus. So an image of Jesus is not is literally a violation of the commandment, of the 10 Commandments. You shall make no images. And now, does that mean you should make no images at all of Jesus? Is the chosen wrong or something? No. If you look at the context of the 10 Commandments, it says you shall make no images to worship them. So there were many images of heavenly beings in the temple, but the 10 Commandments said, don't make images of any of these beings and worship them. So there's a difference between having them as part of your world, but also worshiping them or elevating them in some way. So those are some things you have to take in consideration. But things like crosses, and if we start to venerate any material thing as, it's a symbol. A cross is a symbol. And like I've talked about, the Bible is very symbolic, right? So I have no problem with symbols, and I have no problems with crosses. But I think what you're getting to is a valid warning that don't become so caught up in the symbols that they become the substitute for the reality. And that, what I'm saying? So that's what I would suggest. As Christians, that's the danger of the icons, is that they do become that. And there are, like I say, Hindus, our neighbors, have images and stuff in their house and their shrines and stuff, and they're worshiping these false gods. And when we interact with our neighbors on that level, we go in there knowing this is a spiritual warfare. And we've been in a situation like that where we could sense that this is demonic presence, because they've got these shrines and we know that they're worshiping other gods. But we go in with the gospel with the hopes of sharing the truth with them, and it's not about running away from them. Knowing that there's a demonic spiritual reality behind something doesn't mean you should run from it. It just means it should make you equipped. You should equip yourself with prayer and Scripture. Yeah,
that's true. Another, I think, controversy with a lot of Christians is rapture, the rise of Antichrist, the second coming of Christ. Are these also symbolism or something symbolic, things like that.
Well, now you're branching out here.
Sorry.
We could have we should have an entire podcast discussing the last days and the end times, because that's a whole system. And I will close with this. I will say, you actually bring up a very good point. And I do believe that a lot of, not all, but a lot of the modern day Christian prophecy systems are idolatrous, in the sense that they have sought to spend all their time and effort seeking to connect the dots and trying to find the Antichrist, pin the tail on the Antichrist, and looking at the modern news and trying to find the connections, that they spend their whole time in their pursuit of their system. And ironically, if you look at the history of most of these systems of Christian prophecy speculation, they've been wrong for 2,000 years. I mean, every generation is saying, we're the last generation, and here's all the proof. Here's Ezekiel, here's Jeremiah, here's this, here's that. And they're always wrong. Always, always, always wrong. And of course, I would argue they're all wrong now, too, because they're misinterpreting Scripture. So let's leave it at let's take a look next time at what is the symbolism of prophecy. If you're going to read prophecy and you're going to approach it and say, well, it must be literally what it says, because that's how God speaks. No, that's not how God speaks. If you study Bible prophecy, you see that Bible prophecy is heavily laden with symbol. It's told, not exclusively, but heavily through symbolism, and an integration of symbolism with historical reference, of course. It's not just meaningless, obviously, but it's symbolic. And you have to understand the symbolism, or you are going to misread the symbolism of Bible prophecy. And that's why I would argue most Christian Bible prophecy pundits today are completely wrong in their interpretations, in their system of interpretation, because they're not reading Bible prophecy. They're reading it more literalistically or hyperliteralistically, rather than understanding the symbols in the New Testament, how they are rooted in biblical prophetic symbols in the Old Testament. And once you understand their Old Testament context, it sheds light and helps you understand the meaning in the New Testament. And that, like I said, that requires some in-depth discussion. But yeah, I would say that end times has become an idol where, people are just, everything they're saying is, whatever's happening now. These Muslims are, over in England, they're all, they're rising up with violence. Oh, it's the end times. The transgender in America. Oh, it's the end times. Everything's the end times to them. Everything's the mark of the beast to them, and nothing ends up being the mark of the beast. And so the problem is that they're misinterpreting the symbolism, and that's why. And we've created these systems where Christians have spent all their time on obsessing over their systems instead of spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is discipling the nations and getting them to obey Jesus in their personal lives, which also then spreads out to their communities. So, True. Yeah, it definitely can become an idol.
Yeah. And we're not supposed to know exactly when the last days are. He gave us signs, but we're not supposed to know exactly when that time is or when that day comes. But we should always be prepared anyway. So, but yes, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you working on any new books or projects? And where can our listeners find you?
Okay, well, all my books are exclusively on Amazon. They're on Audible books, they're paperback, and they're Kindle. And they're, I've written several theology books like what we've been talking about today. The Imagination of God, God Against the Gods, Hollywood Worldviews. Just find my name, Brian Godawa, on Amazon. You'll be able to find those books. But also my books, which is retelling Bible stories, called Chronicles of the Nephilim, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and Chronicles of the Watchers. All three series are retelling Bible stories with this angelic warfare in mind. And if you want to learn more about me, my website is godawa.com, Godawa.com. But if you go straight to Amazon, I've got a lot of my bio info and everything is on Amazon as well, and that's where you can get all my books and learn more about them before you even buy them.
Yeah, and you got those awesome book trailers that I love.
Oh yeah. So, if you go to Godawa.com, sign up for my updates, and you'll get things like when I get a new trailer for one of my books, I'll send it out. But right now I'm working on my latest Chronicles of the Watchers novel. It should be ready by the end of the year, and it's on the book of Maccabees, the story of Maccabees. It's the supernatural story, true story of the origins of Hanukkah, which is an ancient Jewish feast that came about in between the time of the New Testament and Old Testament. Very interesting concept.
Yeah, that is. Ooh, I can't wait for that one. Well, I'd love to have you come back on and talk about the end times, the last days, maybe the symbolism for that.
Be prepared to have your mind blown, though, and it's going to be
Yay.
controversial, and you'll get a lot of hate mail
I
because
know.
Christians are very closed-minded and blind, actually.
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes they are, the worst critics. They're really hard, but that's okay. That's what this is all about. We just want to open people's minds. I mean, seriously, it's, we just gotta I think, just open up a little bit and not be so closed-minded.
Yeah.
But
in fact, that's my big argument, and that's what we'll talk a little bit about next time too, is the need for Christians to stop becoming as polarized as the world is, where someone has to agree with you about everything or they're a heretic. You know what I mean? And particularly with theology, Christians are notorious for that. And if you've been on the other side, like I have, you learn quickly how bigoted and how ignorant and blind it is to really have that extremist reaction. Yeah,
I agree. Well, Brian, it's been such a pleasure having you back on the show again. I always enjoy our conversation. Your
Likewise.
Insights always bring amazing, just opens everything up. So thank you again for sharing your thoughts, your fascinating perspective on your books. I love it. And I'm sure the listeners have gained a lot from what you shared today. And I look forward to having you come back in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, and that brings us to an end of another episode. I want to thank my special guest, Brian Godawa, for sharing his insights and exploring these profound themes with us today. It was truly an enlightening conversation. Also, to keep this show free, I'll be adding some promotional codes in the description. If you purchase through those links, you'll get a discount and I'll earn a small commission at no extra cost to you. You can always find the podcast on our website, sensiblehippie.com, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Follow us on social media to stay connected and never miss an update. Until the next time, remember, the truth is often stranger than fiction, so keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep your mind open. Ahui ho kako. Bye!
I can see you down again, falling to the ground again. I feel you. Try to fight it on your own. I'll help you light your fire. I'll take your hand, raise you up higher. You can dare to live. Stand up, be the hero you need, the dreamer you dreamed of. Speak up, scream in the mirror. You're free, you're free, you're free now. Light up, you can feel the heat of the spark, the beat of your heart. You can dare to live, dare to live. take your hand and raise you up higher. You can. You can dare to